Good morning. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I was just looking across the room. I may have a little bit of neck strain by the end of this session from turning my head from side to side. So if you want to move to the center, please do so. But let's go ahead and get started. Our session is on servicing update. I'm Lisa Oldre, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Federal Student Aid, and my role within FSA is the management of oversight and monitoring of our servicers. Destre Holloway is my co-presenter, and he leads the team that does the actual monitoring events at our servicers, both on-site and off-site. One update that we have, and it came from the general session. You might remember Jeff Baker indicated that there was still 800 numbers out on websites, and he wanted you guys to check those numbers and pull them off. I have the 800 number with me, and I'll give it to you if you want to jot it down. That number is 800-848-0979. Again, it's 1-800-848-0979. Whoops, there we go. So our agenda today is really to go over just our general servicing updates and contract information and give you a little bit of information regarding the portfolio that we do oversee and manage, as well as some of our key projects that we're working on to standardize our processes within consistency and leveraging the best that we possibly can get out of the new processes that we're putting in place and to minimize risk for our borrowers and our taxpayers. Then we're going to look ahead to some things that we have in the works or things that we're thinking about doing in the future for 2017, and then we'll open up for question and answers. So at this time, for oversight and monitoring activities, we have 4 TIVAs that we do performance on, and they are Fed Loan Servicing, Great Lakes, Navient, and Nelnet, and 5 not-for-profit servicers, which are Cornerstone, Granite State, Haskell Financial, Mohila, and OSLA, which is the Oklahoma Student Loan Authority. The one that has left is VSAC, and that's the Vermont guarantee, or servicer in Vermont. They asked to have their contract with us terminated, I want to say it was late July or in July timeframe. So we moved all of their loans from their system over to a platform much like theirs, that came from the same system, which was at Nelnet, and that was done in early August. So we did it in a very methodical fashion in which we moved all of the active loans first, and then we moved the remaining data. So all of the loans that were on their platform, whether they're paid in full or transferred or what have you, those are all been moved over to Nelnet, so we have the full data sitting over there with all of the images and documentations and so forth. And with that transition, we wanted to make it as smooth as possible for those borrowers and students, so we maintained what we call the lockbox, which is the payment address where the borrowers make their payments to, as well as some residuals of websites and phone numbers and those types of things, so that it was seamless to a borrower as to where they were calling. They didn't essentially know the difference until they were notified that their loans were moved. So this is a little bit of a snapshot of what we have that we are doing our overseeing and our monitoring. So as I mentioned, we have the 9 primary loan servicing contracts. And within those contracts, we have what we call our specialty programs. So the TPD, Total and Permanent Disability, is under our purview. Public Service Loan Forgiveness, PSLF. TEACH, which is the Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education, and the Perkins Loan Program. So in addition to doing monitoring and oversight of all of the normal student loan borrowing aspects, we also do monitoring and oversight of these as well. And you can see by the numbers that are listed here, there's a large group of employees with our servicers in many locations, and we look at multiple servicing platforms. And you can see by the volumes that they're quite high. Now, these volumes are from the end of September. We know that they've risen since then. And in addition to that type of oversight, we're constantly looking at the number of calls. We review those calls. We listen to those calls when we're on site. We also listen to them when we're back in our offices. And when we do our reviews, as Destre will go through, we look at the correspondence from soup to nuts. So when we're looking at a borrower's account, we're looking at all aspects of a borrower's account to see if it's been performed from the beginning to the end. Depending on what that review might look like, we might be focused in one center, but we are holistically looking at a borrower's account. Some of the changes that we put in place for the allocation, which is this really just means how are loans assigned to our servicers when they're coming off of our COD system. So in the past, we had different measures, and we made a change in July of 2016 that was more for us to align the portfolios and to make a measurement across those portfolios so that we could look at them evenly. You know, we always hear people say apples to oranges, those types of things. Well, we needed to make that balance so that we could look holistically at our portfolios and make those determinations of where the allocations should go based on performance. Because as you all know, our servicers are performance-based when they get their invoicing and their payments, and as well as their allocations. So we did that balancing effect in July, and it seems to be working for us in that regards that we're evenly looking at our portfolios. So we had an imbalance of accounts in which there might be higher put loans with a particular servicer than others. There were more consolidation loans at one servicer versus another. There were older loans that were in repayment that could be at one servicer versus another. So we had to make that balancing efforts, and this was the logic that we used to do so. And if you want more information on that, you can go ahead and go out to the website. And as I said, we are performance-based compensation for our servicers, and we strive to review for the consistency. And this is where our focus will be when Destre starts his portion of the presentation, as well as the monitoring and oversight, which is where we do most of our work from my organization standpoint. So in the past, when I've done this presentation, I have told you that Mr. Runcie has given to us or charged with us at FSA what he calls his 4 guiding principles. And let me remind you what those are, because I've told you that what they were before. It's that we need to be accurate and accountable, accurate and actionable, consistent, accountability, and transparency. So we use those 4 guiding principles as we start marching through our process of monitoring and compensation for our servicers and our oversight. So with that, the monthly payments are based on loan statuses. So again, I told you that our servicers are incentivized to do the best that they can for your students, our borrowers, to maintain a active, valid, good standing status, which is generally repayment for our borrowers. So the matrix, if you look at it, is they're incentivized to keep them in that status as best they can, and the per account or per dollar account goes down from there as a loan becomes delinquent or is in a forbearance status or deferment status or something along that lines, where we're not doing active maintenance on the loan. And our metrics are much like they have been in the past. So again, with the performance based in mind, the performance is the highest percentage that we're looking at for our metrics and our invoice payments and our rewards. So you'll see that the satisfaction of the borrower is still one of the things that we do. We used to do this via phone call to our borrowers, and in 2015, early 2016, we converted to an email process. And so we're getting a much better response from your students when we reach out to them from email versus having them pick up the call, the phone call. And then we use FSA also contribute to the metrics for our services. We give our reviews of our services as well. So again, with those 4 guiding principles, walking through some of the consistency items that we have, one of the things that we focused on a lot in 2016 and really geared up for 2017 is a follow-up process. So this is that interim period, work in process type period, if you're an operational type person, in which a borrower is submitting information to our servicer and it's not correct. There's something missing, something's invalid, something's not quite right. So we took look at what that process is, and we did a lot of reviews with our servicers, both on-site and in-house, to look at what is happening in that time period with our borrowers. Why are they not sending what we asked them to send? Is it the information that's coming out in the application or the upfront material that's not clear? Or is it the conversation that they're having with the servicer that's not clear to them, and therefore we need to make it a little tighter so our borrowers know what it is that's expected for them to return, and we'll have an upfront clean application. So with the income-driven repayment plan, that was a big hit for us. And this also went along with President Obama's mission to have an increased number of IDR borrowers in the program. So we took, again, look at that process and realized there's a lot of borrowers still sitting in that middle ground of, I want to do this, but I didn't complete it. So we put in place with all of our servicers in May of 2016 the follow-up process. And that entails we give them scripted information about when we wanted to make calls to these borrowers who are incomplete, what kind of follow-up we wanted to do, whether it was written or email, and then a continued follow-up if they didn't do what they said they were going to do after the first attempt. So we went through there, the defined letters, the information. We did see a positive response with the follow-up. Interestingly enough, if you reached out to a borrower and you got them on the first try, that's generally when they did what they were supposed to do. The longer it went from that application, the return value was much less. We also took a look at our discharge process. And when I say discharges, I mean the full gamut of discharges. We have a lot of them out there. And part of the problem that we were seeing with the discharges is our borrowers, your students, didn't know what they were. They didn't know what was available to them and when it was available to them. So we need to plant that seed with them early on. So I invite you to do that with them when they're still on your campuses and talk about those discharges that are available to them. They have a little tickler in the back of their mind so that when it's relative to them, they can pull that file back out of their heads and remember what it is that they're supposed to be doing, or have some sense of what it is that they could be applying for when it comes to discharges. So that being said, we also went back through in our process flows here to try to streamline some of those as well and do that work in process that we talked about for processing when applications are incomplete, or when they're stagnant, or it looks like a borrower started a process and called in about it but didn't complete that. So the two that we focused on most within this process were the TPD process, which is the total and permanent disability, and that follow-up that goes along with that. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the changes we did in TPD a little bit later in the presentation, as well as the closed school process. So we're using that same methodology that we put in place for those two, or forthcoming in the closed school, and we'll adopt it to some of the other discharges that we'll be putting in place. But it's a process. It takes a while to develop the letters and the communication, because we want it to be the same across the board from all of our servicers. And that message that we're putting out is early awareness, again, planting the seed with the servicer or with the borrowers to know that those discharges are available, is the same message all the way through the program. We don't want to change the verbiage so that the understanding or the intent doesn't look like it changed for the borrower. It was the same from the beginning to the end. So we're working hard on the communication, and to say that there's just a few letters is an understatement for any of these programs. And the Destre will go through this later, but when we started looking at what we thought was going to be 10, 15 letters, it's more like 30, 40 for a particular program or a particular application process through our servicers. So it's a daunting task that we've undertaken, but we'll get through it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Destre so he can dive into more of the monitoring and oversight activities that we have going on within FSA.
Good morning. So this slide really is just to illustrate a few of the areas that the monitoring and oversight team works with on a continuous basis. We'll go into a little bit more detail on some of these buckets on some upcoming slides, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these now. But the one thing that I really do want to point out, this is not all-inclusive. This is just really, truly to highlight some of the different areas. We have a call monitoring team, which monitors borrower calls at all of the servicers, all of the call centers. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what they do upcoming. As Lisa mentioned briefly, we also do correspondence reviews where we're looking at communications that are going out to students, parents, any borrower, and we'll talk a little bit more about that communication strategy on some upcoming slides. Site visits is something that we do annually, at least once a year, with each servicer. And during those site visits, we're basically doing on-site monitoring of specific topics, various things that are going on. Important to note that although we do go at least one time per year to every servicer, at the same time, we are also doing constant monitoring of various topics back at the FSA office. We have a whole team of people that are doing various reviews at the same time. We do also work with CFPB, the Department of Justice, and in terms of listing state agencies up there, one of the things that we have to be very mindful of is that although we don't have regulations over those state agencies per se, the servicers do, and so we have to be very mindful of what we're putting in place to make sure there's not any conflict between what we're saying and what they're saying. The next two, internal control audits and financial audits, kind of go hand in hand. And I think the most important thing to note related to this is that the servicers each do have independent audits going on, while we also at FSA perform similar audits. So there is duplication there, but it is important to ensure that both audits are accurate. In terms of call monitoring, a couple of things that are really important here is that we do perform a daily review of statistics. We're constantly monitoring the servicers in terms of their response time, their average speed to answer, how long borrowers are on hold before they speak to a representative, and what their abandon rates are in terms of how many borrowers tried to call in but actually hung up before they were able to speak to a representative. And it's not something that we're just looking at, but actually something that we work very closely with the servicers on. If we see there's a spike in phone calls, we reach out to the servicer and try to get additional information as to why they're seeing that, what's causing it, is there something that we can do to assist. It's really a tool of analysis, and it's very helpful in ensuring that we're providing the best customer service to all borrowers. The calibration metrics and feedback process, when we look at method of resolution, what our monitoring team is looking at is not just to ensure that the borrower got a resolution, but they're listening to the calls, listening to the borrower, and truly understanding the root cause of the call to ensure that that borrower received the right resolution. So not just a quick solution, move on. It's truly the servicer is providing the right resolution for the long term for the borrower. Sometimes it may be a short solution, and that's all the borrower needs. Sometimes it's a much longer solution. And so we're ensuring that those customer service representatives are taking the time to truly understand that borrower situation and their needs. We do use the error rates. We look at the error rates in terms of the servicer customer service centers. And it's not just to point out your representative made a mistake. It's truly to look and find any trends or analysis to see if there are training issues, if there's something that FSA put out that is confusing, is there anything that we can do to assist and make sure that it's clear for the representatives, and so they can communicate that to the borrowers. We do also use that a lot for trending and analysis and our analytics. The next team that we have is separate from the call monitoring team, but very intertwined, is our process monitoring team. And what the process monitoring team is really striving to do is to ensure, one, that there's servicer adherence to federal regulations as well as requirements. And we're looking to ensure that there's consistency. Having different servicers, we want to ensure that the borrowers are treated consistently and that there's consistent interpretation of what the requirements and regulations are. So we also are looking to really uphold program integrity. In terms of our vision, we're looking truly to improve the borrower experience. The servicers as well as FSA are very focused on ensuring that we are providing top-notch customer service to all borrowers, and so that is really what we're looking for there, as well as we look to uphold our responsibility to the taxpayers, which is, I think, a message you've heard in probably several other sessions too. But that is something that's always on the forefront of our mind, that we want to balance fantastic customer service with our responsibility to everyone in the United States. The next two bullets actually go hand in hand a little bit. While we do monitor a primary monitoring topic, so we have one specific area that we're focused on during a particular review, at the same time, we really do focus on a full account review from the beginning, as Lisa kind of briefly mentioned, from the beginning of that account to the end, and everything that has happened in between. So we are doing a complete review of all of the financials, any military benefits, any deferment, forbearance, other entitlements that this borrower should have been eligible for, as well as a complete review of the entire customer service record. The consistency and accuracy you've heard already, and we'll continue to hear that because it is something we are very focused on. Like I said earlier, consistency amongst all servicers. Change requests. Essentially what a change request is when there is a change that we're asking the servicers to do regarding a requirement that was currently in place. So a change to anything that they've been currently doing. And we do proactively monitor any change requests. Right after those changes are implemented, we go in and do a review to ensure that all of the servicers, as I mentioned, are understanding what's been asked the same. So that way every borrower is receiving the same message and the same treatment. Proactive servicing evaluations. We obviously want to be in a position where we are not being reactive to something that's happened, and so we look into the future and know what's coming up. Great examples of this are IDR forgiveness, PSLF, and so we work very, very closely with the servicers to ensure that we have the plan in place so that when the time comes, we are in a very good position rather than being reactive to something that's gone wrong. And collaboration is obviously very important. You saw on the slide earlier all the arrows pointing outward, but those arrows really probably could be going back and forth. There is constant communication between the servicers and between those various groups and FSA in working together to make sure that we're all providing the best service to our borrowers. I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of what we're looking at. In terms of the numbers and delinquency statistics, we're obviously very interested in how the borrowers are performing in terms of in repayment. We are looking at call center statistics and income-driven repayment statistics. We do have touch point calls with our servicers where we go over, and that's not just the oversight and monitoring team, but there's a wide group of people at FSA who attend these calls where we go over the delinquency stats, the call center stats. We go through these numbers And we go through the work in progress reports and all the reports that you see on the right-hand side. And really, this is for trending, for analysis. It's not just simply to look at numbers. We use this to just look at peak times that we know are coming up. We look for trending and obviously for more analysis. We also look at this for data integrity and to ensure that we're seeing constant numbers or appropriate numbers. And so we cross-reference to ensure that everything is in alignment. Some of the things that we're looking at in the call stats I mentioned earlier, but they're really looking at the volume of calls, the number of calls that were handled, and then, as I mentioned, the abandon rate, average speed to answer, talk time. In terms of the reports that we're looking at, everyone's always interested in the work in progress reports, or the WIP reports, often referred to that. We look at all of the processes that the servicers are working on to ensure one bucket's not growing, one bucket's not really small, and to see what's moving around and what can be shifted around to ensure that everything is moving forward, nothing's getting stale. So we pay very, very close attention, as well as the servicers on their own pay very close attention to their work in progress reports. Ombudsman escalated issues in control mail. Not everything comes through the feedback system, and so we do also work on those issues as well. Default aversion strategies. Everyone in this room is very interested, hopefully, in default aversion. And so we pay very close attention to default aversion strategies. One thing that I will point out, and you'll see on an upcoming slide where I'll show you a breakdown of the portfolio, but one very interesting thing is in terms of borrowers that are 270 days or greater past due. We recently did a poll of the servicers, and there is a very, very large number of borrowers in that bucket who have never returned a call to their servicer. And there's truly no reason for anyone, in my opinion, no reason for anyone to be in that bucket. The servicers are so willing and able and capable of helping these borrowers. And from a school perspective, anything that you can do to truly encourage your students that their servicer is there to help. They are not an entity to fear. They truly want to help. You saw by Lisa's numbers that they're incented to help, but beyond that, they truly care about the customer. And if the borrowers would just simply pick up the phone, there are so many options to prevent them from getting into that bucket ever. So something very important from a school perspective to stress, from entrance counseling to exit counseling, that they are truly there to help and they have a desire to do so. Financial reporting, obviously we're looking at that. Top inquiry reasons is something that we pay attention to. Why are the borrowers calling in? Why are the schools calling in? Is there something that we can do to help? Generally, a borrower is calling in either to make a payment, ask about a payment, ask about their loan status. From a school perspective, it's generally to inquire about what's going on with the loan status of a borrower. And often, I think the third reason is simply just for a password or assistance logging in. You've seen these numbers a couple of times, and this is pretty self-explanatory, but the number of borrowers that the servicers are dealing with, 37.5 million, this was at the end of 2016, for just over $1 trillion, and the average borrower has approximately $27,600 in debt. Here's the snapshot that I was speaking of earlier, and you can see this, the in-school status starts at the 19%, and then this goes around clockwise. And you can see from this chart that 17% are 271 days and older. This does not include the borrowers that have moved on to default management collection service. So the other thing that's important to mention here is that borrowers need to really truly understand they don't need to pay to get help. The servicers are there to do it for free. This is an additional breakdown of the servicing snapshot. It will show you the number of borrowers. About 56% are still in a standard repayment plan. 24% have moved to an income-driven repayment plan. A lot of those numbers moved from the alternative repayment. And as you may recall that President Obama's initiative to truly push borrowers towards IDR. One thing that I will mention too is that it is very easy on studentaid.ed.gov. There is so much information regarding IDR. There are calculators out there where borrowers can estimate what their payment would be, what plan they would be eligible for, and there's also a really easy button for them to click Apply Now. And one of the things that we have been seeing in our training and analysis is that, I think Lisa mentioned this, but borrowers that are applying for this online electronically, it's so much easier and faster for the servicers to process these versus those that are coming in on paper. It's less likely that the borrowers are going to forget something or make a mistake, and they don't have anything that they need to send in. The reasons that they're being sent back to borrowers or denied are usually due to an incomplete, inaccurate, or they're missing information, or they haven't provided proof of income or alternate documentation of income. So the more we can push students to apply for that electronically, the faster, easier, and more accurate it will be. Again, we'll talk about consistency and some of the program changes. Quickly, I'll go through some borrower outreach and communications. And these are the 4 buckets that are the primary focus for our targeted improvements related to communication. So we have in-school, in-grace, repayment, and discharges, and we'll go through those relatively quickly. In terms of targeted improvements, our main objective is to get the word out, to use consistent and plain language, and then appropriate method and timing. And I'll talk a little bit. In terms of getting the word out, obviously we want to make sure that students are very aware of the different benefits that they're eligible for. And a lot of these tie back to the Borrower Bill of Rights. Consistent and plain language, we've really focused on having the communications that are going out to the borrowers be very simple, easy to understand, and to make any processes not seem cumbersome or too difficult that they would turn around and avoid it because it just seemed too difficult. Appropriate method and timing, that really boils down to knowing what to say, when to say it, and how to say it, and how to get it to the borrower. So we'll talk a little bit more about methods using social media, text messages, emails, letters, phone calls, and really timing that to the life cycle of where that borrower is in the life cycle of their student loan, knowing what makes sense to them and what's important to them and when it is. This is an example of communication outreach that we've done, and this was a partnership between the White House and FSA and our communications, and really some targeted communications going out. We've reached over 8 million borrowers in fiscal year 16 about IDR plans and other potential loan forgiveness, such as the public service loan forgiveness, as well as communicating with borrowers in their grace period. I'll talk a little bit more about that, or I'll show you a little bit more information on the next slide. We won't go through this slide in entirety, but to give you an idea of repayee, we reached over 3 million borrowers, in grace 2.5 million borrowers, and PSLF 3 million borrowers. We do stagger these outreach initiatives so that servicers are not bombarded, and then we would turn around and see higher abandon rates. So really strategic in terms of when we're sending out these communications. And I won't go through it, but you can see off to the right-hand side, it really focused on specific borrower segments. In school communications, again, entrance and exit counseling, very important. And very important that A great question is simply to ask your student, who is your servicer? Make sure they know who their servicer is. Make sure they know how to get in touch with them. By this time, they should have already received an FSA new borrower letter, which introduced their servicer, so they should be aware of who their servicer is. And they should also have received a servicer welcome letter and packet. They're also getting quarterly interest statements, and there are additional communications going out to borrowers in the school. So they really should know, but if they don't, it's very easy for them to find out. In Grace, really focused on understanding what borrowing means, understanding the benefits of an ACH or having the payment taken out of their checking or savings account. They're also getting quarterly interest statements, as well as being provided with communication related to IDR and PSLF. We will not go through all of these, but as you can see, during repayment, the amount of communication that goes out to these borrowers is phenomenally increased. Inbound calls, outbound calls, text messages, mail inserts, as well as social media. Campaigns about income-driven repayment, as well as information for the borrowers to understand how they can make a payment. Discharge awareness, as Lisa mentioned, we really want students to understand what types of discharges are available. We are actively identifying potentially eligible borrowers. We have proactive email campaigns. The servicers do have a specialty call line set up. There are specialty call lines for military borrowers, TPD, I'm just naming a few, not an all-inclusive list, as well as Teach Grant recipients. The identified dispute process, I think Lisa mentioned earlier, that also really what that is for borrowers that have applied for a discharge and have been denied for one reason or another. Once that denial happens, a very specific letter goes out to that borrower, or communication of some form goes out to that borrower to advise them exactly what they didn't provide or need to provide in order to be eligible for that discharge. This slide, I sincerely doubt you can read the letters, the words on, and that's okay. The main point of this slide is really a visual. What this slide represents just is to give you an idea of what the servicers are required to do between 0 and 270 days past due, and what they actually do. The top blue boxes, that is according to regulations and requirements what the servicers are required to do, the number of communications. The bottom, green, yellow, orange, red, that's actually what they do. So as I mentioned earlier, the amount of communication going out to borrowers before they actually get to 270 days delinquent is phenomenal. And there's really no reason for anyone to be in that bucket. The last thing that I'm going to talk about before I turn it back over to Lisa is just to highlight military benefits. We're very focused on military borrowers and the benefits and entitlements that they have. And so we do have an increased effort to promote awareness of service member benefits, including SCRA interest rate cap, as well as military service deferment. The servicers do a monthly data comparison to the Department of Defense database, where they take their entire portfolio, bounce it against this database. They receive something back that says, here are all of your borrowers that are in active duty. They then in turn automatically apply the SCRA interest rate cap to those borrowers. So there's nothing that they need to do to get that benefit. They also have a dedicated phone line for service members, and that can be found on their websites and in their communications. These are prior service members themselves who are manning those phone lines. And so I think that's a very nice thing that the servicers have to offer to our service members. And with that, I will turn it back over to Lisa.
Have to get the glasses. I'm getting to that age, those that know me in the room. I want want to talk a little bit about some of the process changes that we have either just recently implemented or things that we are working on or in process or having discussions along those lines. One of the things that we did put in 2016, and this is again in conjunction with working with some initiatives coming out of the White House, and this also came up at the open forum, I believe on Tuesday, about billing statements and interest notifications. We tried to, as best we could, put, again, I use the word canned messaging. We wanted it to be as simple as we possibly could, that plain language, and using the same statements across as much as we could within those. For all of our servicers, the message was clear to our borrowers about interest notifications. We call it interest notifications here, but it really was aimed at your students and borrowers who are in school and in grace. So the focus was to reach out to this group of students on a quarterly basis to indicate to them, what is it that you've borrowed? Here's the amount of money that you've taken out and what's the impact to you. And within there, we also described how that would look and that dollar amount would look, or an example of how dollar amounts would look under various repayment programs, so that students were aware of what it is that they have in their borrowing power that they were using when they were taking out these student loans. It did have an impact and has had an impact on these students. We see it coming through our feedback system. Now, you might think that some of this information would be negative, and I guess it's how you view it, and was it used for the purposes intended. So an example would be a student may withdraw based on the dollar amount that they're seeing on their notification going out to them, because they realize the amount of cost it would be when they come out of school. So we have seen the feedback that students are withdrawing and taking another look at their budgetary needs and the education or the school of their choice. So I look at this and say, I'm happy that these students are realizing what it is that they're looking at when they're seeing their statements and taking control of what that means to them in the future. So hopefully we see this trend continue, and that awareness is there. If we could just get in front of it a little bit more, I think that is where we really want to aim, so they have that information before they make that decision, because we don't want to see them withdraw. But it is a purpose for withdrawal, and we have seen that come through our feedback systems. So again, that goes out on a quarterly basis to those in school and in grace borrowers. And the total dollar amount is always on their billing statements. We realigned some of the billing statements, which of course are the monthly payments to the in repayment borrowers, and so that there's the same notifications going out to this group of borrowers as well. The payment processing, this one is forever talked about, and we continue to talk about it because honestly, there's no right answer, right? About how do you apply over and underpayments for a borrower who didn't tell you what they wanted to do with those overpayments. Last year, my whole message was about counseling borrowers when they call in, and we still continue to do that. And when I say we, I really mean our servicers over here. Do the counseling of the borrowers and understanding what is it that borrower needs. Is it immediate relief, or is it a long-term plan that we have to put them on? So the answer might not always be an IDR plan. The answer might be putting them in a short-term forbearance to get them over that little hump. And the same thing applies to the payment processing, right? So one could look at it and say, if I'm looking over the overall loan, it might be best to pay that amount of the higher amount of the highest interest rate loan on an unsubsidized loan. Let's start marching down the path and getting that one unpaid, or getting it paid off. But if you didn't have that conversation with the borrower, how did you not understand that perhaps it would be better in their situation to pay down a loan that has a small balance, so they have more discretionary income every given month? You don't know that. We're making assumptions. So this is one of those that we keep teetering back and forth, because there isn't a real right answer unless the borrower tells us what that right answer is. Right now we are leaning towards the higher interest rate, because that gives us more bang for a buck of the population of the borrowers, of course. But that doesn't mean that when that happens, a borrower can't call. It's a little difficult to undo something, but we can certainly do it. But we want to make it best for the borrower, so it's always good, again, to have that contact coming into us. And the credit reporting. This one we worked on and continue to work on with our counter agencies within the government. So we work with the CFPB. We've been working with Treasury. We've also been working with our industry counterparts within SALSA and some of the other industry groups regarding credit reporting. Student loans for credit reporting does not necessarily fall into the bucket of mortgage loans or other short-term debt loans, such as car loans and those types of things. And the process that we use is a file through Metro True, which is accommodated by all of the major credit reporting agencies, and that's our filing system that we send our information off to the major credit reporting agencies, and we send the information on a monthly basis, and of course we start reporting delinquency at 90 days past due. That part of it is a little easier. It gets a little bit more complicated when you start walking into the discharges and the default statuses and what does that look like across the board. Now this is bigger than DL. This also includes the FEL world as well for the credit reporting. We want to make it consistent so that any creditor or even a borrower who's trying to get other credit, it looks the same no matter who their servicer is or their guarantor. And we're fully aware of the notion of the FICO score, which is the scores that borrowers get based on or any consumer would have based on their credit history. And while certainly we don't want to negatively impact it where we're not supposed to, where we wouldn't want to impact that, and certainly adjust it where it makes sense. As a creditor, you would want to know what that FICO score is, and if somebody is in a delinquency status, then it needs to be reflected as such. But not all discharges should have a negative impact on credit scoring. Delinquency certainly would, and it needs to be the same. So wherever that default is taking place, it needs to look the same regardless of who's reporting it and what impact it has on that credit reporting for that trade line only. And the same thing with the discharges. We have done a lot of work. We are now in the stages of working through the Metro 2 file to get our own language within the credit reporting, so we're not bound by mortgage lending. And so I think that we've gained a lot of progress and a lot of steps have been taken. And so I'm hoping in early 2017, we will start to see those changes come out, and they will be reported, of course, through the change request process to our servicers and through a Dear Colleague to the rest of the industry. We also worked, one of the other initiatives from President Obama was to work within other agencies to gain data that was already there and applicable to our student loan processing. And with that, we reached out to the Social Security Administration, and they are the primary holders for Americans that have total and permanent disability. So we did a data match with them, in which we do on a quarterly basis. And we take our portfolio of borrowers who have active loans that are not currently in a TPD status and send it over to do a data match. They essentially just tell us, these are the borrowers within your list that are totally and permanently disabled on our system. Here you go. So we do an active outreach to these borrowers to tell them that they are selected or they can be approved for TPD. All they need to do is sign this documentation and send it in. We can't do an automatic approval because of tax implications that are tied to TPD at this time per the regulations. So we can't automatically put them in a TPD discharge. We do have to have their authorization to do so. And again, this ties back to where I was talking about before, where we do the follow-up and the outreach. These are borrowers who can, by signing the documentation, can have the relief of a discharge by just sending it back. So we continue to do the follow-up. We do this on a quarterly basis. You will see there's a high number of borrowers within our portfolio that could be or should be approved for TPD if they would just sign the application and send it back. 480,000. So it was a lot of mailing that our servicers were doing, our servicer did for the TPD match, and they do it on a quarterly basis for this outreach. The as one would expect, their early feedback was, is this too good to be true? Borrowers didn't understand what was coming. So we're looking at changing some of the language and the verbiage that's going out to that group of borrowers as well, so it doesn't look like a gimmick. And we're not somebody else that's trying to do something to these borrowers, because we want them to take advantage of it. And of course, the FSA feedback system. There was a couple sessions on that. It was mentioned during the opening remarks. For our purposes here, we manage and have oversight of our own queues within that feedback system, where borrowers might have a complaint or feedback regarding service that they have been offered, and we would respond directly to those. And all of our servicers also have queues within that system, and we monitor and manage those queues as well, so that we're ensuring that the borrowers are getting a consistent response and they're getting it within the time frame that we've committed to this program through the FSA feedback system. So a little bit more on looking ahead. We recently conducted a pilot, if you will, for IDR. Remember, I talked about all of the work in process areas, and we found that there was a lot of work in process, high volume, sitting out in the IDR program. And we've all heard it through the feedback system how complicated this program is. So we're looking at 3 cohorts. We just completed the first one, which is the borrowers new to the income-driven repayment program. And essentially what we did was take verbal confirmation. So a borrower would call in, and of course we had our control group and our pilot group, and based on the selection, we would offer a verbal IDR to this particular borrower. We'd follow them for the next year, and then income would have to be presented to move forward. But again, the questions there, this is really too good to be true, right? I've heard it's kind of a nightmare. I really just have to say yes, and we can move on. So we had people who opted out because they didn't believe us. But we did get our buckets, if you will, filled for the pilot, and we're tracking those borrowers now, and we hope to walk into some of the more complicated verbal pieces, which is the married borrowers because of the dual income. And we also want to target the recertification process. I think in this area, we will be able to really look at the difference between what a borrower, if we do the surveys at the end, right? So the borrower would tell you about the struggles they had from the online or even the paper process, to simply being able to say, yes, here it is, and then confirm your income at the next go around and do that confirmation later. So looking forward to seeing what these cohorts present for us, and working through the craziness that's involved within the married borrowers, because that one's going to be a bit of a challenge. We also are working on more initiatives within the military family, and this is in conjunction with the Department of Defense. Using that same database that we use for SCRA, there's not quite enough information for us to do the automation for military deferments, and particularly those for the zero interest for the hazard pay locations. It has to do with security of information. The military is a little tight about sharing where their soldiers are at, understandably, because that's what the hazard areas are. But we are working with them to identify it by not telling us where they are, just flagging that they are in a hazard pay area, so that we can send that information to our servicers, so that we can automatically apply benefits to those soldiers as well for the military deferment and the zero interest rate. So we're getting closer. Many discussions with the Department of Defense and working towards this. I'm hopeful we'll see something in mid-2017. That's Lisa Oldre's assumption and hopes, so let's see where we get with that one. We also are working with the VA administration within the military. Again, this is more tied to the TPD benefit. If we could get the information, we just started our conversations with them just recently, and a little bit further down the process, because we're already putting in the effort and looking at the budgetary needs for this vehicle. Again, it's much like SSA. We're reaching out to VA to say, here's our list of people. Can you tell us how many of them are VA veterans with 100% disability tied to military service? So we can go ahead and do the same thing, reach out to these borrowers and say, hey, by signing this form, we can apply your TPD benefits to you under the VA discharge process. And I alluded to this earlier about the letters and our outreach. We continue to go through all of those communications with our servicers. We're going through the exercise now of gathering that information and logging, creating our libraries for information and looking at those and determining where we can grab some more of those canned messages. But now we're in the throngs of thousands of communications that we're reviewing and walking through and refining and defining and making them, putting them in that simple language. And again, if it's language that we've used currently, we're going to carry it all the way through the programs so that it's there for the borrower's purpose, not our purpose. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, I wrote it down as the servicer recompete. This is our bad, this is internal speak to us. This is the new contract for single source servicer. That is on the table. I can't go into details. Some of it I don't know, and the others I just can't share. But I can tell you that we are on target to sign that contract or award that contract, if you will, within 2017 first quarter. So we hope to have that done in the near future. And then we'll have a lot more work ahead of us working through that. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. And I know that for anybody over there who has a question, it's a walk to the middle of the room, but we have plenty of time, or you can shout. It takes a little bit for walking, so go ahead.
Hi.
Good morning.
Just a couple things. I'm wondering if you have an idea how long it should take for a student to switch from a standard repayment plan to an income-based one. What's that time frame that one of your servicers would have?
We generally say that the information for payment plan transfers, particularly if there's paperwork involved, right, is within a 15 business day turnaround. So it should fall within that. But that one, if it's going to a standard repayment plan, is a little bit easier versus if you're going into an IDR and you have to have documentation with it. But it's 15 business days is the turnkey.
Okay. And you've given us a lot of information about the servicers. Would you have specific suggestions for us as schools, what we should be doing to help our students make sure they're paying back their loans, be more proactive in our interaction related to students? You mentioned several things, but any other thoughts you had on that would be appreciated.
I'll share my mic with you.
You can go. Lisa always has an opinion. Go ahead, Lisa.
No, I always have an opinion. I'll let somebody else have one. Go ahead.
I think the main thing, as I tried to mention, is just really helping your students understand that the servicers truly do want to help them. They are not like, oftentimes what I see is that a student will get into a situation with their student loans, they become delinquent. It's not the only thing that they have delinquent. And so they start pushing everything over here. I think very important is that this is probably one of the easiest things to get off their back. And so just not being afraid to pick up the phone, call their servicer, see what your options are, because there are options. And I think just really helping students truly not have fear associated with this piece of what's going on in their lives.
And now I have my opinion, right? So there's also a couple other things that you can do. One, you can reach out to the servicers. They have a lot of that information for you in default prevention. There was also a session earlier this week that you can contact FSA for default prevention using NSLDS data and helping you select those borrowers. Again, the servicers have that information for you. There's also information, and I believe it's on studentaid.gov, for schools that you can pull down. I don't want to really call them check sheets, but I don't know what else to call them. But there is material for your use out there for those types of things that you're looking for that you mentioned. That will help you, okay? Go ahead in the back.
Okay. So I know this will be a difficult one, so
Okay.
I just wanted to ask a question. I know this will be hard to actually do, but one of the things that we do is we talk with our students quite a bit about making payments while they're in school on any student loans, for either unsubsidized loans or just to bring their balance down on subsidized loans. When they do that, there's no credit report or credit scoring benefit for them. So as you're working through that process to consider, consistency and changes to the credit reporting process, is that something you've considered to see how Metro 2 formatting could be changed to consider payments made while they're in school?
I'm trying to remember the conversation. It was brought up, so it wasn't a forgotten message, so I'm happy for you for that.
Good.
But I can't remember where we landed. There's a particular code that we had indicated that we could use to say that you were in payment while you weren't obligated to be in repayment. So, but the part that was tricky about that was, what does that do to the FICO score then? Right? So we clearly don't want to have a negative impact on that, but I can't tell you that I thought it went up. I believe it stayed stagnant, so it didn't offer the benefit that we were hoping it would. But if somebody took the time as a creditor to read that trade line, they would see that information. That's what I'm recalling. I was trying to run back through my memory of those conversations. But it was a discussion, and nothing is final in that area. So we'll take a note of that, and we'll take it back to that committee that's working on that to see if perhaps that would be a good place to see it go up.
Has FICO been part of the conversations? I know I spoke with them about it a year or two ago, and it was, if they had some of these codes that were put in place, they thought there was a way to do it. But you would have deeper conversations with them.
And we don't control the FICO score, right? So we only provide the information through Metro 2, and then it's beyond us after that. So our conversations have been with the Metro 2 file, but yes, there have been conversations with FICO based on the groups that I told you, whether it was with Treasury, CFPB, or in conjunction with all of us. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Good. Yes, ma'am.
Two quick questions. When you get all of the communications, the canned communications, consistent and reviewed, will those be available for schools to view?
We were asked that question yesterday, and I'm glad you asked it again today. As best we can, we want to share that information, and it makes sense, especially when you guys are all working on your own default prevention. It would be nice to be using the same language, right?
Absolutely.
So we did write that down as a takeaway, that where we can, we will share what we can. It's just a matter of being able to post it in a way that you folks could all pull it down and use it. So we're working through that, but as we're just starting our process, we don't have a lot to share. We have some to share, and if it's something that you're interested in now, you can leave your name with us, and we'd be more than happy to reach back out to you. But we are working through that, and we are very mindful of it, as it was brought up yesterday as well by several people.
Thank you. One last question.
Yes.
I'm really pleased to see the work that you're doing to be proactive with the SSA, the VA, and the military. But we have a Perkins portfolio. What efforts, if any, are being done for outreach to Perkins borrowers for these programs?
They're included. I'm sorry, I
good.
should have stated that. So as long as we know what the portfolio is, right, because our database is NSLDS, so if those borrowers are present there, they're automatically in that pool. Because they're entitled to those discharges through TPD and so forth. So they're included in that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
So to continue on the TPD topic, I just first want to check an assumption, or my understanding, and that is that discharge through TPD is a taxable event.
It is.
So you are, just to make sure I understand what's happening, you're actively encouraging hundreds of thousands of people who can't make their payments to pursue a discharge, which could potentially end up resulting in a very large taxable event in a given tax year.
Good point. But let's back up and let's talk about the data a little bit. The vast majority of those 480,000 borrowers are in default. Okay? So they're already not making payment. And generally speaking, when you're a TPD, when you're in the Social Security Administration, you have a very low income, and that's part of the TPD program, is that you have an income that's less than the poverty level of 2, a family size of 2. in your state, right? So it's a low income, and while we can't be tax advisors because we work for the Department of Education, there are provisions, and we offer this information on the website, the TPD website, our website, and it's on the letters about where they can call for that tax advice, because you can, I forget the terminology, but you can, I'm going to say petition for lack of a better word, to say that I clearly don't have income, I can't, I just was discharged for $100,000. I can't pay those taxes. So there are ways around it, and I shouldn't say around it, but there are discussions that you can have with the tax reporting agencies and to displace that tax burden, if you will. But I also can tell you that there has been a lot of work around dismissing the regulations that are tied to taxes and TPD discharge, because it doesn't seem to balance, does it, right? I mean,
Right.
these are the people we're trying to, they're at a poverty level. They have to be in the program, and now we're going to slam that with that very large tax implication. And so that regulation is being looked at, probably more so than it ever has before
Great,
in this tax year. So,
Okay.
good question.
thank you.
All right.
Hi.
Well, I have a couple questions.
Okay.
So you mentioned with the TPD, if they give that authorization to the servicer, then they can proceed with that option. But as far as the 3-year monitoring period, is that something that the student still is required to do?
Yes.
Or, yes, and submit documentation for that? Or?
Right. So if you're not familiar with the TPD program, once you have been discharged for TPD, we have 3 years of monitoring behind that to ensure that the borrower is still at those poverty levels and they haven't taken out new student loans, right? The only one who's exempt from that 3-year monitoring, or only cohort, if you will, is the veterans. They don't have to go through a 3-year monitoring period, but the Social Security Administration borrowers do, and those that are certified via physician still have to go through that 3-year monitoring period. So through that 3-year monitoring period, on an annual basis, they are required to certify their income level. They can send in documentation to say that. It can be a self-certification form to say that their income level is below the poverty guidelines. We try to make it as simple as we possibly can for those borrowers, but they still do have to adhere to the regulation of those 3 years.
Okay. The next one is in regards to how often does the Department of Education garnish wages or do the federal tax interception?
Sure. So we call this the top offset in AWG, and I don't know if you heard the question, but the top offset is the Treasury for essentially payback for income on tax returns. That is, in our world, for direct lending, right? It's only when the loan has gone into default, okay? And it generally does not start, and I'm using general terms here, right? Because I'm not the expert on defaulted loans. But if a loan goes into default, it's subject to those tax offsets and AWG at 60 days after it's been at the defaulted agency. What we did do for the Social Security match people on TPD is we took their names off the list of top offset. Of course, they wouldn't have AWG, one would assume, because they're already below the poverty levels and they don't have a job, so we're not going to offset their wage garnishments. So we took them off the list for Social Security matches for top offsets. But otherwise, the other general public would go in. They could potentially be on the list within 60 days after hitting default, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's all kinds of other little rules that apply to that.
Okay, I have 2 more, sorry.
Okay.
And usually we get bars, we handle the campus-based Perkins on campus, and we have our own servicers. But we do get a lot of students that get scared when they get their loans sent to the debt management. Now, as far as do the servicers still reach out to the students once they've hit defaulted, or as far as like rehabbing options, or does that communication stop and then debt management just contacts the student at that point?
I'm going to answer in 2 parts.
Okay.
One, in the general loans that are not including in Perkins, and then I'll answer the Perkins piece of it, okay? So for defaulted loans, our servicers hold the loans default technically at 270 days past due. Our servicers hold those loans until 360 before they're moved over to DMCS. they are actively reaching out to that borrower up to the last moment before it has to be transferred over to DMCS. And for Perkins, it's a little bit different because when you look at the regulations for Perkins, there really isn't a sense of default. If you missed a payment, you're in default on a Perkins loan. You don't have the opportunity of that grace period, or I shouldn't call it grace period because I'm not talking about the 6-month grace, but you don't have that 270 days. But our Perkins servicer, if we have the loans, which we wouldn't have yours, if you have your own servicing, we do reach out to our borrowers for all of the loans that we hold under the Perkins program. And then when they move over to DMCS, then they're in the collections process, and it would follow any of the other collection processes that we have for whether it's a Perkins loans or a DL Stafford loan.
Okay. Well, that's actually my last question. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Our institution tries to get students to come into in-person exit counseling. And I know when we do that, we really do emphasize several times during the presentation that the servicers are there to help them. They're paid to help them. Please contact them. And we do it several times. And I am not sure, because it's been a while since I've actually looked and gone through the exit counseling myself, it might be good if it's not on the online exit counseling several times in friendly language, that they're there to help you, just
Right.
to reiterate that they really are there to help them anytime that there's an issue. I think that would be really excellent because they get lost in the multitude of repayment options and all of these details that are overwhelming. So if we can emphasize that one point, I think it would be such a great help to them.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. We have about 5 minutes, so I see a couple more questions coming. I mean, we were just flashed, so.
Okay. A quick question. I have encountered borrowers who are at 270 days.
Yes.
And they're defaulted. So I would think technically and by regulation, they would be eligible for rehabilitation. But the servicer says, oh no, we don't do anything. They would have to move over to the debt management system before rehabilitation can be worked out as a payment plan for these borrowers.
That's not true. So I'm sorry if you were told that. If they are at 270, our servicers will take information to get them cured, if you will,
Yes.
bring them current, get them on a repayment program, and do what they need to do to save them from going over to DMCS in default. Absolutely, that's what they will do.
Wonderful.
So if you run into that again, you call me.
I will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about discharged loans. If a student comes in, and we've had that, they had a loan discharged. Regulation says they cannot get a new loan and discharge that loan for the same disability. So they have to bring in a physician's statement saying that, unless it deteriorates and whatnot. In the past, there was instructions to send it to COD, but then I haven't gotten any information where to send it. So we were told by Nelnet to just keep it in the student's file. Is that accurate
That
still?
is accurate. We were asked this question at one of the open sessions as well.
Okay.
That is the accurate statement. We have started conversations based on that question the other day about is that really the best place to hold that documentation? Because we have an imaging database and we could hold that information, but it really becomes who's responsible, who's going to need it, what's the purpose for it. And so we have started those. We visited several months ago, and in light of the questions that we received, we marked it back up on front of our list of to-dos and to talk about for TPD. So we do have that. So at this time, yes, you hold it if you're going to reinstate.
And is that just for the 3-year monitoring, or would that be for whatever discharge
2
has
years
happened?
past.
Okay, any past discharge?
What's the 2 years past the 3?
Oh, 2 years past. Okay, thank you.
All right, I don't see anybody else running to the mic. So with that, we thank you, and we hope you all have a wonderful continued holiday season. Thank you so much.